First of all, I want to acknowledge that today will be another difficult day for survivors of mother and baby homes and other institutional systems. It's an extremely sensitive topic, which unfortunately is compounded by the timing of this session on the same day that the Children's Committee will be discussing the Birth Information and Tracing Bill later. Ceann Comhairle Chrissy Tully, now 90 years old, recently described how when, as an 18-year-old, she was incarcerated in the Tuam Mother and Baby Home and her son Michael was stillborn. He was immediately taken away from her in Galway Central Hospital, and Chrissy believes he's in the Tuam site. She is rightly angry and confused as to why this law is even necessary. She said, legislation for what? To open up a grave full of dead babies. I never heard such nonsense. They don't want to open the grave, that's the truth. Where are the children? Where is my son? We've looked and looked, and it's like he never existed. What did they think the babies were? Would they like that done to their own? My son could be in the tank. He could be, but we don't know because they won't open the thing. What's the delay? I have to agree with her. And her son, who I spoke to this week, I still can't understand why we need this legislation, why the coroner hasn't investigated known mass graves, why the guards haven't investigated the thousands of recorded unnatural deaths in mother and baby homes and other institutions. This bill comes after years of inaction and refusal of the state and successive governments to acknowledge existing laws and to provide justice. Just as one example, we have a Coroner's Act where they are obliged to act if there's remains found in their district or if somebody dies in state care or custody. This bill does go some way to addressing these issues, but it's still not aligned with transitional justice and intersectional human rights standards. The legacy of the Irish state's institutional past impacts individuals and families every day. Abuse, violations and crimes continue to have real effects on people. Trauma, unrecognised injustice, stolen identities, these are living issues for thousands of people. This legacy is also embedded in the landscape. In places where some of the worst crimes perpetuated or facilitated by the state, often in conjunction with religious orders, occurred. Former mother and baby homes, county homes, industrial schools, psychiatric hospitals and other institutions have a deeply troubled past, which we must come to terms with. Not only were these sites of incarceration, abuse and violence, but they were also where people died in suspicious and unlawful circumstances. The scale and horror of Tuam forced action on this issue. The callous and criminal disposal of babies and children's remains is still overwhelming. Even more disturbing is the reality that Tuam was not an isolated case. It is likely the most severe example, but we know of similar practices in other institutions. The state is compelled to act. Irish society needs a transitional justice approach to respond to the scale of this issue. Part of the process will be the challenging and painful excavation of known and suspected burial sites. We have a social and emotional aversion to disturbing burial grounds. However, the babies, children and adults who died in these institutions deserve graves, they deserve justice, and they deserve to truly rest in peace. There's an obligation to investigate any and all deaths for inappropriate burials. So although, like I said, it's hard to understand why we need this legislation in the first place, I welcome this bill as hopefully, finally, presenting a mechanism to respectfully respond to our cruel past. I too want to recognise the work of the committee and the Chair, Deputy Kathleen Function, and I want to recognise the work of the Minister in taking on board some recommendations from the pre-legislative scrutiny. Some of the issues identified at that stage have been addressed, and for that I think the entire committee is very grateful. I was especially relieved to see the removal of the restriction on the jurisdiction of the coroner, the strengthening of the role of the director and the expansion of the identification programme. The care and attention given to this bill by the committee contrasts with the Birth Information and Tracing Bill, which we'll be discussing in the committee later. And I suppose similarly, there are several significant deficiencies in the bill which the Minister will need to fix. It must offer a really robust and determined framework to provide justice without political or official interference. The state needs to ensure we effectively investigate unlawful or suspicious deaths as well as allegations of torture or ill treatment. The Director of Authorised Intervention, as the new office is referred to in the bill, must have capacity and certainty to be able to intervene for all victims and survivors. It also must be able to support survivors and families in providing information about the disappearance, the fate of the disappeared person, and the progress and results of any investigation. Minister, my first and major concern is about the requirement to establish a separate director and office to intervene in each site, rather than establishing a standing body which has the capacity to examine any known or potential site. On one level, this is just a nonsensical approach. It's like setting up a separate police force for each individual crime instead of a police force for all crimes. A well-resourced office could build up knowledge and expertise in dealing with these highly sensitive matters. It could foster relationships with all stakeholders, especially survivors and family members. This would be more effective, and it would be more reassuring for those affected. However, even more worrying is that this is a bureaucratic barrier. The bill permits the government, if a location meets a set of criteria, to set up an investigation on the site. This means that survivors, families and campaigners will now be forced to advocate for interventions at known or suspected sites. So once again, the responsibility has been put back on survivors to ask and to seek justice. I think it's safe to say that there's no doubt that the Tuam site will be examined. It has to be. The national outrage and international headlines that forced government to act in 2014 have guaranteed that. But what about the many other sites across the country? How many of those will be deemed eligible? To quote from the bill, the government may, from time to time, having considered a proposal made by a relevant minister with the consent of the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform by order. The government may is the crucial word there. Shall is the legislative language for something that is going to happen. May means it might. With everything we know about the horrors and abuse that happened in these institutions, with the public outcries and the glaring need for truth and justice for survivors, the best the government can say is that we might, in the future, do something about these mass infant graves. We might. Then, perhaps even more restrictive, is the line, with the consent of the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. Here's the cold, cruel reality of this bill. It's about money, not justice. Any intervention at a site must legally get the consent of the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. This hurdle is deeply troubling, given the Department's position on the Mother and Baby Homes Redress Scheme. One of the major defects of the government's proposed scheme is the highly insulting requirements for individuals to have spent at least 6 months as a child in a mother and baby home. Recent revelations show that officials in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform were central to this cruel stipulation. They were concerned with this as a precedent with far-reaching policy and financial consequences that is giving redress to survivors for the worst forms of human rights abuses may see other survivors seeking redress. Not to mention the fact that they also think somebody should get potentially €5,000 for something like a forced family separation, when we all know you could get more for slipping over on a pavement. Money is their main concern, not justice. Then the delayed progress of the scheme. This is the department that will now be given a veto on interventions at each and every site. Transitional justice or an obligation for truth are clearly not a priority for them. Survivors and campaigners have been scarred enough through interactions with the Department of Children, other departments and other bodies, and now they'll have to jump through hoops for the Department of Expenditure and Reform too. Given all we know about mother and baby homes, legal adoptions, other institutions and the treatment of survivors, the need for a separate office for each site is an intentional barrier that is contrary to transitional justice and human rights standards. Unfortunately, Minister, so far you seem unwilling to acknowledge this point. The need to act on Tuam is pressing and highly necessary, but I believe this bill will result in very few other sites being examined, and it's hard to believe that that isn't the intention of it. Minister, give all survivors and their relatives the certainty of a standing independent office which has the capacity and commitment to intervene. Secondly, there are still too many conditions and restrictions. This is another barrier. The committee's report focused strongly on enabling as many sites as possible to be included in the legislation and for the capacity of state agency to examine these sites. We warned that a high volume of conditions and restrictions may prohibit government to act to facilitate exhumations, examinations, identification and investigation. Unfortunately, this is very much the case with the current bill. At all stages, the bill should be orientated to facilitating survivors and their relatives. It should be working in their favour to address historical and living injustices. Whether the people affected want an intervention at a site is a separate issue, but they should all be entitled to that option. The most obvious restriction is that the register of manifestly inappropriate burials is still the primary criteria, while there's not the same emphasis on suspicious or unlawful deaths. The committee recommended that interventions at sites should give due consideration to suspicious or unlawful deaths as well as the existence of inappropriate burials. We also recommended that the bill include any burial site where the circumstances surrounding the death and/or body disposal method warrant an investigation as to their lawfulness. These elements are not properly present in the bill. Human rights experts and those advocating a transitional justice model push strongly for this criteria. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties, for example, has strongly highlighted the state's obligation to effectively investigate unlawful or suspicious deaths, as well as allegations of torture or ill treatment. There needs to be a clear prioritisation of action because of suspicious or unlawful deaths alongside what the bill calls manifestly inappropriate burials. Section 8 also contains restrictions on when an intervention can apply. The inclusion of the need to respect the views of the relatives of persons buried in the land is an important aspect which featured prominently in the committee discussion. It gives recognition of their role in the process. However, other restrictions are too vague and unnecessary to the extent that they seem like intentional barriers. The social and economic interests of the state is the clearest example. What does it mean? And what possible measure could be used to objectively measure that? Economic interest means money again. An intervention could be refused because of a potential cost or because of the budget situation in any given year. This is an ambiguous and relational standard, one that is not compliant with human rights and transitional justice and has no place in law. The history of injustice surrounding this issue and the refusal of state bodies to engage with survivors, give them basic information or recognise their rights at all combine to indicate that this criteria can and will be used to refuse interventions. Also, it's worth noting that this would be the state's social and economic interest, not in the people's and certainly not in the survivors' interests. The inclusion of public health is another ambiguous criteria, and ironic given our chronic underinvestment in that area. Similarly, archaeological features, which are regularly paved over for infrastructure projects, are being elevated in significance to prevent examinations of sites. Minister, are we serious with these restrictions? An investigation and evacuation of mass graves may be refused because it's near a standing stone. If this was not such a serious topic, I think it would actually be comical. You have to recognise these features for what they are, barriers, outside of providing for the views of relatives and the dignity of the deceased. Section 8.3 has to go. This bill has to be about facilitating interventions, not putting more barriers in place for a group of people who have suffered oppression and injustice for all of their lives. The committee's first recommendation is very clear. The focus of the bill should be on victims and survivors and their rights. The bill should not limit the extent to which the various sites can be investigated. Currently, the bill does not do this. There are multiple interconnected and reinforcing limitations.